I'll just say a generic, all old friends and new friends. It's good to be back home. This is where I started my career in Gujarat, and I was here for almost 12 years before I left for foreign shores. Well, not very foreign, Gandhinagar, but away from this place. And it's good to be back over here because fortunately my campus has shifted from Gandhinagar to Baroda, so I've come back over here again. So it's good to be back home over here and good to be back in this hall where we used to do a lot of things. So thank you for inviting me, first of all, the management, HMPIETR Institute, and all my dear colleagues, friends, old students, etc., Alumni Association. And thank you for providing me with the challenge of doing something like this. Because I don't really know where to start. Because I guess, as the previous speaker, Dr. Talati, when he was speaking in the morning, he mentioned there is so much that you really don't know where to start. Okay. And then relating it to language education is another challenge in itself. Okay. So Bhartrihari once, long time back, in Vakyapadyam says that language creates ripples in the ocean of reality. Okay. So we have an ocean of reality. What language does is it simply creates ripples, okay, just waves. Because the ocean of reality is never cognizable. You cannot recognize it. You cannot see it. The only way you can see it is through language. In fact, it will go on to say that language will create reality. So language creates reality for you. And therefore, it is a very challenging job to kind of bring together this entire tradition, and I will call it tradition, though it is, the system almost tells you that that it is a very coherent, homogeneous idea. It's not. There are debates that go on for 2000 years. There are concepts that are debated for more than 4000 years. Okay? A single concept. So you really cannot think of Indian knowledge systems and without thinking about the tradition of Indian knowledge systems, because there is a whole tradition. So you can't take a text out of that tradition and say, well, let's look at this text, because the text belongs to a 1000-year-old history. There has been debates. So in the Indian knowledge systems, one of the important things to remember as students, I think, and as scholars, as colleagues, is that there is always a Purva Paksh. Okay? You cannot ever say anything. So no one considers oneself as a scholar. You should have the humility to say there have been people before you who have already contributed to the knowledge. And whenever you write, and this is another myth that I think we need to come out of, that our tradition is an oral tradition. No. Ours is a written tradition. Orality is a part of our culture. But knowledge is written. That is where the British found it very, very difficult. Because they had encountered cultures which were so-called oral, okay, before they came to India. Ours was a written culture. Everything was written. Cultural forms can take oral forms, but knowledge systems were written systems. There was no concept of, giving knowledge through orality. Orality was an important part, but everything was written. Panini's Ashtadhyayi is a written grammar. It's not an oral grammar. Bhartrihari's Vakyapadyam is a written text. It is not an oral text. Patanjali's Mahabhasya is a written text. Yaksha's Nirukta is a written text. So writing is an important part of this culture. And I think we should try to get out of that myth that ours is an oral culture. Cultural forms have orality. So you might have drama. You might have certain forms of telling stories, kathas, for example, akhayakas, for example, which are oral in nature. But that doesn't mean that we never had writing. Writing is something that came later. No, we had writing right from the beginning. right? And therefore, when we come to Indian knowledge systems and the immense amount of writing that has happened around it, what I've tried to do is I've just tried to do what should not be done. So I've tried to take certain ideas and see whether we can relate it to what was really happening. So I'll just try to give you an overview of what. So this is just an overview, remember, and I hope that you will have enough interest to go back and read on your own. Yeah? So what are we going to do? The first thing that we're going to do is that we need to understand that within the Indian knowledge tradition, there is no distinction between language, knowledge, and interpretation. If you have language, then you have knowledge, and it's not a law of causality. It's not that you get language. Language is there, knowledge is there. In order to achieve that knowledge, you need to go through interpretation, and therefore you need to have interpretation techniques. Okay? So you have to interpret in a certain way. Okay? So this is the first thing that we're going to look at. And how does it transform into language education? How do we apply it to language education? The second thing, and that is very, very important, people think that Indian knowledge traditions are, grammar or rituals. Okay? So let me make it very clear that there is a very clear distinction right from the beginning, right from the Vedic texts to Vedangas, between what are known as the Karmakandas. Okay? So in the Karmakandas you will have certain group of texts, and you have the Jnanakanda, knowledge forms. Yeah? And the Karmakanda and Jnanakanda are very, very clear. It's very clear in the system. They are never collated together. Okay? Now, in the Indian knowledge tradition, it is very difficult to make a distinction because Karmakandas will also have Jnana. And Jnanakandas may have Karmakandas. Karmakandas are primarily ritualistic action. Okay? So, rituals that you perform, for example. Jnanakanda is explanation sometimes of those rituals in a knowledge system, but sometimes also extraction of the Karmakanda into knowledge. Okay? So how do you explain what is the knowledge that is getting formed? How do you explain that knowledge, etc.? So this is the second part that we're going to look at, and one of the important things that we have to remember is, see, if I teach you maths, and that's why everyone was laughing in the morning session when Tarati sir was speaking. He's a person from mathematics. Okay. Imagine that he gave you a lecture on maths. And I'm sure 10-15 minutes down the line you would be thinking that when is it going to end? Okay. But what did he do? And that is the tradition that we carry almost genetically within ourselves. We have the tendency to tell stories. Okay. So how do you, if I give you a self-help book, how to achieve success in 7 days? I can give you a formula. In 7 days, you do this, you do that, etc. But if you look at self-help books, that's not how it happens. They tell you stories. Okay? The monk who sold his Ferrari. So you have a story. Yeah. The Alchemist. These are all self-help books. But remember that knowledge of self-help can only be passed on to you through stories. And therefore, within the Indian knowledge tradition, stories play a very, very important role. Narratives as knowledge. Narratives not simply as entertainment or pleasure. So people who come from BA English and MA English background would know there is this whole debate in English criticism. So is knowledge, or is literature for entertainment, or is literature for learning something?
Art for art's sake, art for life's sake.
It doesn't matter. In Indian knowledge systems, we don't get into that debate at all. It is assumed that narratives are knowledge bearing. Narratives contain knowledge. Okay? And the way that it can be spread across all sorts of cultural forms is through narratives. Okay? So we'll look at some of these use of narratives and what role do they play for language education. And the third thing is we'll take a time jump because we are in an institute which is HMPIETR Institute of English. So I'll give you some examples of what happened, because there seems to be some sort of a misconception that when English came, everything else disappeared. So English destroyed it, and we keep on blaming Lord Macaulay, he produced the minutes, etc., 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 which is not true at all. Okay, let me tell you that. So we'll see, because some of the earliest challenges of the British was not teaching English. It was teaching Indian languages. So when they first started a college, and I'll talk about that in greater details later, they were not teaching English. They were not concerned about teaching English. In fact, they were never concerned about teaching English. They hated Indians to learn English. They were getting worried that they were learning English. Okay? And we'll see how this entire idea that Indian knowledge systems disappeared after the colonial education came in is not true at all. Okay? We'll try to see how it continued in different ways, in different forms, etc. Now, as I told you, this is more indicative, so I'm not going to go into great details, but hopefully we'll have discussions and questions at the end, and we can have a conversation then. Okay? So let's come to the first one, language, knowledge, and interpretation. Now, as I told you, language, remember, is something that is not simply seen, as B.Ed students and MA students, we are constantly told language is a tool for communication. How many of you actually believe it? If it is so communicative, there will be no misunderstanding, no? Why do people fight? Why do people get angry? Why do people say, sorry, I didn't mean that?
Defective to the
Why do people keep on apologizing? So it's not that language is simply a means of communication. Of course, it's a means of communication. But language's central purpose in the Indian knowledge tradition is it is a repository, a storehouse of knowledge. Okay? And in order to, because it is a storehouse of knowledge, you have to be careful on how you use language. Okay? In fact, Panini says that, so he calls it Shishtachar Nyaya. So follow people who can use language in such a way that you can learn from them. Avoid abusive people. People who use language in such a way that you don't learn anything. You will learn the abuse, but there is no knowledge contained in that. Okay? So follow those people. So knowledge and language is central to the system. So these are overlapping in the Indian knowledge traditions. So I'll just read out something from Atanu Upanishad, and this is what they say. By speech, the Vedas are strung. By speech, the meter are made. Remember, it almost covers everything. So the way you speak, the meter. By speech, friends are united. By speech, all beings establish their intrasubjective knowledge. You can only know someone through language. There is no other way. You can't know that love at first sight doesn't exist. So there is nothing called love at first sight. You will know only when someone speaks. Okay? So knowledge comes through that form of a language. Okay? It is a very romantic idea, love at first sight, given, but unfortunately in the Indian knowledge systems we don't accept that. We say, okay, you speak and then probably you will have love at first sight or love at second sight or third sight or fourth sight, but that's irrelevant. So intrasubjective knowledge is important, and relations, and hence all this is speech. So any knowledge of reality that you need to have is through language. There is nothing else. Okay? And this is Atanu Upanishad, which is around 2nd, 3rd century BC. Yeah? It's very difficult to date texts in the Indian knowledge systems. It's very difficult. You will have a lot of debates. Some people will say 7th century, some people will say 5th century, because historical evidence is very little. Because remember, it's a tradition that keeps on building upon itself. So by the time the text is written down, it is maybe 2 centuries later. So we don't really know when the text actually started. The second thing that I wanted to tell you about this is, and this is from what is known as the Vyakarana tradition, the grammarian tradition. They say that there is a very strong relation between Shabda, the word, the artha, the meaning, and the Brahman. So remember, language is not simply about talking about reality. Language is also something that can take you beyond reality. Okay? In fact, Bhartrihari in Vakyapadyam doesn't use the word Shabda, but he says, for the sake of clarity, I'll use the word Shabda Brahman. So the Shabda itself is Brahman. Okay? So the word itself carries the possibility of knowing a reality beyond what you see. Okay? So Shabda Brahman. This is the second thing that I thought I'll point out. Now, as a part of this tradition, therefore, you have huge amounts of texts that talk about the nitty-gritties of language. Okay? In fact, I'm sure in BA, MA, you have done phonetics, right? Phonetics and phonology and all that. So I would suggest that you go back to the Pratishakyas. Pratishakyas are texts that are texts of phonetics and phonology. Okay? Some of the earliest texts which developed as the Vedangas. Okay? Now remember, just to give you an overview of how the system works or how the tradition works, so you have the Vedas, but to explain the Vedas you need other forms of what are known as colors. Okay, so you have other forms of arts to understand the Vedas. And remember, this includes all forms of arts. Okay? People say 64, actually 64 is a number that was given only in the 14th century. So the earliest forms of disciplines, it has 28 forms of arts. So you have phonetics, phonology. In order to understand the Veda, you need to understand how the languages, how the mantras are produced, etc. And Pratishakyas are one of the earliest forms of text that are books of phonetics and phonology. Okay? Giving you in detail every sound with its possible manifestation, but also, interestingly, and we say that many of the Sanskrit texts do not have context. They are simply texts. They do not tell you the context. Pratishakya texts also tell you, and I'll give you an example, how the Saurashtrian woman, this is an example from one of the Rig Pratishakya. So there is this sound in Sanskrit called the Ra. In Hindi it's written like this. You must have seen Ra. Run. So that Ra. So he said the Ra should be pronounced as the Saurashtrian woman from the western part of the country pronounces it. That is there in the Rig Pratishakya. This is 4th century BC. Okay. So this entire myth that phonetics and phonology is dry, it is only sounds, no. They'll tell you in what context, what sound is pronounced, what is the best pronunciation of it. Okay? You look at a book of phonetics and phonology today in English. Does it tell you in the province of whatever, Gujarat, A is pronounced like this? No, you don't have examples, right? So Pratishakyas take care of the variations as well. They are aware there are phonetic variations, there are phonological variations. Okay? And that is acceptable. So this entire concept in English language teaching of this intelligibility, people who are from the ELT background would understand, so this global intelligibility is already there. They are aware that in certain regions of this place, certain sounds, certain words are pronounced in different ways. Okay? Now, what do Pratishakyas do? Why are they written? The reason is there is a lot of debate on how should the Vedic chanting be done. Now, again, there is this misconception, there are the 4 Vedas. That's what you know, right? So what are the 4 Vedas? So which version of the 4 Rig Veda you know? There are 11 versions of the Rig Veda. Okay? Because the Vedas are attributed to a seer, a rishi. Okay? So there are 11 versions, out of which then you finally come to one accepted version. Okay? So there are similarly 26 versions of the Samveda, etc., etc. So we also need to understand that this concept of the Indian knowledge system as something that is given to you as 4 Vedas, etc. It's not like that at all. It's a very, very diverse system. Yeah? Now, one of the problems of that happened after the Vedic rituals started taking shape is that how do you pronounce them? And the Bhattacharyas were primarily written to produce that pronunciation, keeping in mind there are regional variations, contextual variations, etc., etc. Yeah? Another important thing, of course, is Vyakarana, so grammar. Okay? And the best example of that is, of course, Panini. Yeah? And you can't read Panini's Ashadhyaya because it's a formulaic text. It is written in the form of formulas. So it's not going to explain you grammar as you think grammar is. So it's not a Wren and Martin. It is something that is a formula that will help you understand the structure of language. He's talking about the structure of Sanskrit, but it can be applied for any language. So if you use it for Gujarati, 85 to 90% of the rules apply in Gujarati as well. Because he is giving you the general structure of language. He's not really concerned about just one. He's using Sanskrit as an example. But this is the general structure of language that Panini talks about. Okay? And of course you have commentaries on Panini like Bhartrihari and Patanjali and what is the Kosta, for example. So there are huge amounts of commentaries on, because as a non-expert, it is impossible for you to understand Panini. So someone will have to explain to you what Panini really does in the form of grammar, etc. Now for all of this, remember, the central concept is what I said at the beginning. That these are all, so language is not simply a tool of communication, language is central to knowledge. Without that, you cannot have any knowledge at all. Okay? Bhartrihari will go on to say that it is language that creates reality. There is no reality otherwise. So what you see as real is not real unless you have language for it. In fact, he gives you an example that is 2,000 years or 3,000 years later, Bertrand Russell will give. So he gives you the example of, so there is a text called Yoga Vasishtha. In Yoga Vasishtha, there is a story. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, there were 3 princes who used to live in a city called Void. V-O-I-D, Shubhnya. These 3 princes, 2 of these princes were not born. And one was yet to understand what being born means. Okay. And the story goes on like this. They went to a river that did not have water. And it goes on. Okay? It's almost like reading an absurd play. But what is it doing? It is basically telling you that whatever you see as reality can be created through language. I can make you see Shunya, though you cannot see Shunya. Okay? Just like Bertrand Russell later would say that I can say the word unicorn, and you can imagine what a unicorn is. You cannot see it. When you read Harry Potter, you know those things don't exist, whatever those things are. But you can imagine it because it's in language. So language creates those forms in reality. Yeah? Now, if this is true, how do we go to interpretation? So language creates reality, language creates knowledge, this is fine, and this is the tradition, what the tradition does. Now, one of the things of interpretation, and these are just a few ways of interpreting language, some of the areas that are really focused upon is, for example, linguistic change and variations. In modern times, there is a discipline for this. Anyone?
Sorry?
So in today's times, in today's ELT and linguistics, there is a specific discipline that is associated with linguistic change and variations.
Corpus, child rights.
general
Not semantics, but semantics. So parts of pragmatics, parts of sociolinguistics, and parts of what we call historical linguistics. Corpus in a certain sense. Now remember, Yaksha's Nirukta is a text. And I'll just give you one example from this. Nirukta is a text of etymology. Okay? So where do words originate from? Okay? And he gives you different kinds of examples. He uses examples from Sanskrit, he uses examples from Prakrit, from Apabhramsha, etc. Okay? Different languages that are present. And Nirukta gives you examples of not only linguistic change, how the meaning changed historically. So again, this idea that Indian knowledge systems do not have history is again a very, very loaded idea. It is there. So if you go to the text, you notice how Nirukta looks at a word and says, well, at this point of time, this was the meaning of this word. Okay? He takes the example, for example, of the word chaga. Okay? Now he says, what happens, the word is used constantly in many of the ritualistic action in the Vedas. Okay? It was originally meant to indicate a goat. But as tradition started evolving, Nirukta points out that chaga in certain regions, for example, he mentions the central Malwa region, what we call Madhya Pradesh today, the word also came to mean a particular kind of green grass. Okay? So chaga, or goat sacrifice, in these regions became grass sacrifice, etc., etc. So he gives you historical variations and changes in a word. Okay? This is one way of interpreting. So you look at linguistic variations, you look at linguistic context, you look at linguistic history, and look at the change in the word. Yeah? The second thing that they do is, how do they interpret, is this entire debate between what is textual language, language of a book, and how that bookish language is getting used outside. So in modern ELT terms, language in use and the ideal language form. All of you understand this. Remember linguistic competence and communicative competence and all that. So this debate is there already. So what is linguistic competence? Linguistic competence is the knowledge of the language, grammar, syntax, morphology, etc. But when you actually use the language, that is the communicative competence. Okay, language in use. So when you use the language in a certain context, that becomes a different kind of a language. You might play with the grammar, you might play with the syntax, morphology, etc. And it is there in Panini itself when he's writing the grammar. So he's aware of the fact that grammars always take into consideration ideal speakers. See, you cannot write a grammar keeping in mind how everyone speaks. You have to write a grammar keeping in mind who the ideal speaker is. Panini calls it Vaidiki. Okay? So that is the ideal speaker language. This is how people would, in an ideal situation, use grammar, use conjunction, use sandhi, etc., etc. But he's also aware that there is a loka vyavhara. So there is a people use language in a certain way, in certain context, in certain sense. Panini says, unfortunately, I'll not be able to talk about it because there are so many variations. So I cannot do it. Okay? But people should do it. People should have grammars of loka vyavhara also. Okay? So interpretation of a language is not simply through the structure of grammar, but how also people use it, how language in use operates. What is communicative competence is also equally important. Much before Delheims, if you know Delheims, the person who invented communicative competence. So much before Delheims, we already have this concept of linguistic ideal, but also communicative possibility of that ideal getting translated into actual language. So interpretation can be at both levels, both at the Vaidiki level and at the Loka Vyavahara level. And of course, there are different theories. I'll not go into the theories because I'm sure that people who know Sanskrit in the audience would know, all of you know Karaka theory. No? Gujarati grammar? Grammar was very boring, so yeah.
You're referring to Karta and Karaka.
Yeah. So it is basically agentive action. So Karaka theory looks at language as, see, for any language to happen, someone has to speak, okay? Or someone has to write. So there has to be an action. And when someone does something, something happens. That is what language does. As one famous language philosopher, Wittgenstein, said that or later Saussure said, much later. So Wittgenstein, for example, said, you cannot have a story where you have just a line says, there is a cat. It cannot be a story. But it can become a story if you say there was a cat and a mouse. Now there is a possibility. Okay? So there is a possibility that the cat and mouse will fight, or they will become friends, or they will become lovers, we don't know. Okay? But there is a possibility of that. Yeah? Saussure also said that you cannot have a language. Remember, Saussure was a professor of Sanskrit. The great structural linguist. So Saussure said that you cannot have a language with one sound. It's impossible because there is no difference. So you need to have at least two sounds to have a language. Okay? And that is the crux of the Karaka theory. So you need to have an agent and you need to have an action. Okay, and of course you can have different forms of actions, different forms of agents, etc., etc. And that is one way of interpreting language. I'm sure that many of you would know Sphota theory, and this is by Bhattacharya. So Bhattacharya's concern was, how do you understand meanings? How do we get to the meanings of language? So when I'm saying something, I'm assuming that all of you are following and understanding, which is always a wrong assumption, but it's a good assumption to have. It gives you confidence, you know. So Bhattacharya said, how do we understand the meaning in a language? So if someone says something, how do we understand it? Okay? And there was again I told you, some of the concepts are debated for 2000 years. In fact, this concept of how meaning is created between the Vaiyakaranas, the grammarians, and the Buddhists, it goes on for 2000 years. It's not a matter of 5 years, 10 years. Nowadays, you know, you see something on social media and you completely forget all about it in 2 minutes. This debate goes on for 2000 years. And the major debate, I'll just tell you very briefly what the major debate is. The Buddhists believe that meanings come through negation. They call it apoha. Okay. What does it mean? Meanings come through negation. This is also the problem that Saussure gets in. So Buddhists say, if I say the word cow, yeah, it does not lead you to the meaning of the word cow. What it leads you to is the difference with other words. So they call it the apoha. So there is absence of other words, and then you get to the meaning of the word cow. So you, in your head, your brain is the fastest computer that was ever invented. What it does is, according to the Buddhists, that you differentiate the word cow from cow, mouse, so whatever, different sorts of words, and then you understand that, okay, this is what the word means. The grammarians say this is impossible because this is an infinite regression. How long will you keep on saying this is different from this is different from this is different from this is different from this? You will never reach the meaning of the word. Okay? And this goes on and on. And extremely complicated debates. So when Bhattacharya comes to the scene, he says, okay, let's come to a synthesis. Okay? So he says both the positive and the negative meaning is important. So we need to know that the word go is different from other words. Otherwise, you won't get to the meaning of the word at all. If you think go is the word for everything else, then you will not understand the meaning. So you need to realize that there is this. But you also need to understand that go means something. There is a positive meaning attached to it. Okay? But this is where Bhattacharya differs. So he says that positive meaning comes through the word sphoter, comes from the etymological words foot. It's an explosion. Okay? So according to Bhattacharya, meaning comes from an explosion. It explodes. That is how you get to the meaning. Okay? So it's not either through positive recognition or negative recognition, but it's almost like, and he talks about 4 levels of language, but let's not go into those details. So when you reach that level of meaning, what you do is there are kind of this minor explosions in your head. So when I'm speaking, what is happening in your head are minor explosions. And that's how you are understanding. Hopefully, you are understanding. Yeah? If those explosions don't happen, then you won't understand. Okay? Now, I'm not in the habit of kind of saying that, see what Bhattacharya said modern science is doing. But now we know that what neurolinguistics has told us is that whenever you understand something, there are brain neurons that flash. You can actually see it on a screen. So there is a spark of neurons. So certain areas of the brain spark for certain kinds of understanding. Okay. Now Bhattacharya, of course, didn't know modern science, but he kind of intuited that there seems to be some sort of an operation that helps you to understand what meaning is. So that's the sphoter theory, the explosion theory. I don't know how to translate it otherwise. And of course, you have the Mimamsa theory of interpretation. These are the 3 major schools of interpretation. Mimamsa, I'll not go into it again in details, but Mimamsa is basically, they believe that language carries what, how many literature people over here? All of you have done literary theory? Remember our good old Derrida?
Yes.
Derrida?
Yes.
Literary theory? So Derrida has this concept of the traces. So what he says is language meaning is not simply what is contained in the word, but it also contains traces of other elements. Mimamsa theory actually says, and they call it apurva. Okay? So you get to the meaning not because the meaning is there in a sentence or a context or a language, but it carries traces of what you have already learned. Okay? And that is another theory of interpretation. So the apurva theory of interpretation. Remember, Mimamsa was primarily concerned with ritualistic actions. So they wanted to say how to perform rituals, etc. Karma kanda. So if we have this theory of interpretation, can we draw some understanding of how it relates to language education? So we have looked at language and knowledge, language and reality, language and interpretation. So can we draw some conclusions of, because we don't really know, I told you it's very difficult to get historical evidence of how languages were taught. Okay? We do have around the 7th century and the 5th century AD some what are known as charits. You know charits? Ramcharitmanas, the most famous one. So charit is basically life. Yeah? So life writing. So that is what charit does. So you have examples of what kind of education used to happen, for example, in Harshacharit. Okay? But that is much later. In the early days, we don't really know what sort of language education happened. But we can draw some inferences from some of the things that are mentioned in the texts when people talk about it. I'll just give you an example from Panini. Now, Panini mentions that there are what he calls prokta texts. Okay? Now, what is prokta? It is something that is created by someone. Okay? And these group of texts will have your own compositions, compositions of others, samhitas. Samhitas are explanation of the Vedic texts. The Brahmanas contains the first narrative texts. So you can have different kinds of Brahmana. The most famous Brahmana is Shatapatha Brahmana. Brahmana has nothing to do with Brahman, the caste. Brahmana is a group of texts. Okay? So the Shatapatha Brahmana actually tells you that these kind of stories are useful for understanding Vedic literature, etc. You have the Kalpa Sutras, you have the Siksha texts, and that's what Panini mentions, remember. So texts which are especially meant for teaching. Grammar, Vyakaran, Pratishakyas, phonetics and phonology, Nirukta, etymology, and Chanda texts. So basically meter, how does meter operate, etc. And Panini says that this is the perfect way of teaching a language. Okay? So you have some basic ideas of how language education happened. Okay? Again, there is this notion that only Sanskrit was taught. No. Panini mentions Apabhransha. And he says there are many, in fact, he says in the northwestern provinces, probably what we call Afghanistan today, remember he himself comes from that region. He says Apabhranshas are more popular than Sanskrit. Okay, so there are different kinds of languages getting taught, but this seems to be the model of language education. Panini mentions also Krita texts. So Krita texts are basically texts that are created by your own, so you create them. Krita is your own text. And you have Akhayikas, which are stories, as the name suggests, and poetic compositions. So these were again getting used for very modern language education system. I'm sure that when you go back to your school days, this is what you did. No, you did grammar, you did poems, you did short stories. This is exactly what Panini did in 7th century BC. Okay? So what we have is this possibility of language education through different sorts of narratives. And you have Vyakhana, which is the text of commentary. So in order to explain certain texts, you also need text of commentary. And I'm sure in your BA and MA days, I hope you have not used them, but you used to have these guidebooks. No? So you also have guidebooks over there. But these are good guidebooks. They are commentaries by scholars. They are not commentaries by Ramji Lal, etc. So, with due apologies to Ramji Lal, he was very popular. But, I mean, you have commentaries, so you have Panini's commentaries on Panini by Patanjali, by Bhattacharya, etc., etc. So all this forms a part of the language education tradition. So let's now come to how was this done? So what was the method? That is the question that we keep on asking in ELT and in English education. What method should we use? Okay, so what was the method? And the method was what was known as Nyaya. Now, Nyaya is nothing to do with justice. Okay? It is not justice. Nyaya, you know there is a school of philosophy called Nyaya Vaisheshika. It has nothing to do with logic. Nyaya is basically an illustrative example. So if there is a problem in the class, how do you explain that problem? So you use an illustrative example to explain, to resolve a problem. Okay? So it's an illustration. And there are different kinds of Nyayas. So in case a student finds a problem in understanding a grammatical part, okay? So the teacher doesn't say you get a 0. The teacher doesn't say that go back and read the text. Or the teacher doesn't say that you go and ask this other teacher. The teacher finds a way of an illustrative example that could throw light on the problem. Okay? And then explain it. And therefore many of the Nyayas are called Deepa Nyayas. So Deepa, you know. So it throws light on something. And there are texts and texts and texts running into thousands. Today, Talati sir pointed out that when Nalanda was burnt, more than 9 lakh books, maybe more than that, were burned down. So many of these texts are lost. But we do have some access to some of these Nyaya texts, which are illustrative examples of what could be used to explain a particular concept. Okay? For example, common things, so the first one is Ghata Pradeepa Dhanya, for example. Okay, so you use, Ghata Pradeepa is, you know what a Ghata Pradeepa is. So Pradeepa inside a Ghata, okay? Lampshade, okay? You use lampshades, no? So Pradeepa, lamp inside a shade, okay? But what it does, a lampshade does is, it illuminates the inside, but it also illuminates the outside, okay? So examples of this kind were called Ghatapati Panyaya, etc. And the common problems that are discussed in the literature, I won't give you the, but if you're interested, I'll give you the references of this. For example, how do you solve the problem of collocation? So how do you explain Samskriti, it's called in Sanskrit. How do you solve the problem of commixture? So how do you make this distinction between Shankara and Samskriti? Samskriti is collocation. Shankara is mixing of two images. Okay? How do you solve it? And I wanted to put this in because it's a beautiful Nyaya. So it says it's a, if someone can read this, Khira Nira Nyaya. Khira Nira Nyaya. So, you know what Khira Nira is? Milk and water. So if you mix milk and water, that is a collocation. You see the example? Because you can't separate them. Milk and water can gel together. So that is a collocation. So it's an image that is almost combined in such a way that you can't separate those two images. A Shankara is Tila Tandula Naya. So Tandula is rice. Tila is sesame seed. Now if you mix rice and sesame seed, then rice remains rice, sesame seed will remain seed. That is the Shankara. Okay? And these are the kind of illustrative examples that are used to produce language education. Okay? And there are different ways of doing this, not only between language, but also between textual types. So what do you call, so this entire debate about what do you call a particular kind of a meter or a chanda? Okay? Why do you call it that? Now if a student asks the question, what is the difference between Deepaka and what is the difference between Patanga? So, two types of meter. So you will have different illustrative examples of that, etc. So I thought after all this heavy dosage of IKS, I'll tell you the story. The best stories are in the Panchatantra. So please do read it. The original one, not the abridged one. Okay? So there is a story about, I think 3 Pandits or 4 Pandits, right? Actually, Panchatantra is full of these Pandit stories. So one, of course, you must be aware of is the one about the lion. Okay? You remember that story? So this story about they encounter a lion, etc. But this story is not that. This story is, these 3 Pandits have gone to a school. So the problems of school education, the story tells you. They have gone to a school and they told their teacher that they have learned everything. And the teacher says, good, so you get your degree, now you go out and not find a job. Basically, they are walking after, going out of the school. So on the way, you know the story, on the way they encounter a river. I'll just give you one example. And in their school, remember, they have been told that in order to cross a river, they have been told you need a patra. Okay? Now, patra in Sanskrit can mean 2 things. Patra can mean a boat, but patra can also mean a leaf. Okay? So they see a leaf floating on the river. So one of the Pandits jumps onto the leaf, believing that it will help them cross the river. Okay? And he of course starts drowning. So one of his friends says that, catches hold of his hair and tells him, oh, don't drown. But he remembers another thing at that point of time. Okay? So if someone is in danger, there has to be a ghatana. You know, ghatana is, you know what ghatana is? How do you translate it? Anyone can help me?
Sorry?
Incident?
Incidents.
Not ghatana. Ghatana is to reduce. Okay, so ghatna, which is come into English. So ghatana is to reduce. Okay, so if there is some danger, you have to reduce the possibility of danger. Okay, so what he does is he takes out a knife and cuts off his friend's head because he interprets it as something that if you reduce the size of this man, other than that, so what the problem is that you have also have stories about the problems of education, okay, where they tell you that bookish knowledge can be extremely problematic, and therefore you need to have applicability of that as well. You can learn all amounts of theory and all sorts of nyaya and all sorts of things, all sorts of grammar. You could be a greatest grammarian of all, but finally you need to go back to life and lead the life in your own way. Okay, so right interpretation is very, very important. This leads us to the second part that I thought I'll talk to you about briefly again, on the importance of narratives. So how does all this knowledge translate into narratives? Okay. Now let me start with the narrative first. So I'll read this part to you, and this is from the Shatpatha Brahmana. Now, one of the interesting things that happens in the Brahmana texts, remember these are mostly explanations of Vedic rituals. Most of the Brahmana text explains the rituals that are there in Veda. So it's basically a karma kanda. So Brahmanas, Samhitas, they are mostly indicate ritualistic action. But one of the interesting things that you start seeing in Brahmana texts is, whenever there is a story, the story begins with Vach has disappeared. Vach is speech. Yeah? So there is a disappearance of Vach. Okay. And remember, if Vach disappears, then the world will come to an end, right? So the Vach has to be recovered. And therefore, then Brahmana tells you that you have to perform this ritual to Brihaspati or this ritual to the state, etc. And in this way, and therefore Vach can be recovered, etc. Okay. Now this is an interesting story from Shatapatha. What happens is Vach disappears, and the story tells you that gods were very tired of Vach getting. Vach is a goddess in the Shatapatha. So they were really tired that every time she disappears, there is a problem in this world because people can't communicate, people can't read, people can't perform any action. So what they do is they divide Vacha in the drum, music, lute, the axle, the wheel, any indicative of action, and the bowstring, the archer. So Vach is now present everywhere. So it's present in music, it's present in language, it's present in everyday action, and it's present in warfare, warrior. Without language you can't have war. No? You just can't go and drop a bomb. You need to have a fight first. Without that you can't do anything. And because it is now divided, remember, it cannot escape from all the places at the same time. Okay. And therefore it says, it is the sweetest sound, the speech of trees and gods. Okay. Now what this kind of stories tell you is that it is absolutely important that narratives are central to the language system. So one of the things to learn a language is also to depend on the narratives, because they simply do not teach you only language, but also the knowledge that is contained in the language. So narratives play a very, very important role. And this is, I think, what Talati sir was mentioning. Okay. Now if you look at this early syllabus, what we call syllabus today, from Chandogya Upanishad. Okay. So other than the Vedas and the Jyotisha and logic and ethics, etc., so I've just highlighted the ones. So we have Itihasa. Itihasa is not history, by the way. Yeah? Itihasa are stories. Mahabharata is an Itihasa. Okay? Ramayana is a Mahakavya. So there are different distinctions. So Ramayana is not Itihasa. Mahabharata is an Itihasa. Itihasa is not history. Again, let me repeat it again and again. People think that Itihasa is history. It's not history. Itihasa is a way of telling stories. Okay. So this is what has been. This is what the word means, Itihasa. So Mahabharata is an Itihasa. Mahabharata is categorized as an Itihasa in the poetic tradition. You have the Puranas, which are Indian stories. You have ancestor lore. Okay. So stories about your ancestors, and this could be local as well. And the fourth one that you see is serpent lore. Any idea what serpent lore is? They were called Naga Kyakas. So stories about Nagas. Okay. And therefore remember that almost in every major epic or story that you know, Nagas play an important role in those stories. Okay, they might be villains, they might be heroes, but they play a very, very important role. In Mahabharata, they play a very important role. Parikshit, for example. Okay. So Naga, serpent lore is a very important part of the storytelling tradition. Now, if this is the syllabus, what used to happen? And this is again from Taittiriya Arjanakas, and this is what it says. To teach anything, one needs a narrative. If you want to teach anything, you need a story, a katha. To tell a narrative, one needs meditation, tapas. So it's not that you just come and say anything you want and then everyone claps and go away. You need meditative techniques to tell a story. And intellect. So it has to be intelligent stories. It's not stories that excite you for some time and then they disappear. These are not Insta reels, okay, or shorts for that matter, okay, which you scroll through and they don't leave any imprint on you. So these are stories that should leave an imprint on you, and therefore you need the tapas and the medha, the intellect and the meditation. Yeah? And these are the kind of stories. I'll not go into this, and as you can see, so that are quite so. Anandabhadra's Dhaniloka is basically a commentary on the poetic tradition, but also a commentary on Bharata's Natya Shastra. Okay. So where he mentions these kind of stories that were very commonly used for teaching purposes. Okay. And as you can notice over here, these are stories written in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Apabhramsha, and different types of compositions, Muktaka, etc., etc. Okay. So what we call lesson plan, be it people, lesson plan, so you have a lesson. Okay. This lesson can be a poem or a story or a realia or whatever it is. Okay. So that lesson plan, according to the Indian knowledge systems, has to be based on a story or a form of a narrative. Okay. Only then can knowledge happen. Otherwise it will not happen. But remember, not any story. So an Insta-reel story will not do. The story has to be based on tapas and medha. So it has to be intelligent and meditative. That can make you think. Okay. So stories are not supposed to make you relax and go to sleep. Stories are supposed to make you think. And that is the central part of the Indian knowledge system. It doesn't ask you to close your eyes and meditate and forget about everything else. It's not bhakti. It is thinking, it is rational, it is critical. So criticality plays a very, very important role in Indian knowledge systems. Until you're critical, you cannot do. Bhattacharya, in fact, in Vakyapadyam says, if you listen to yourself all the time, you don't learn anything. What is the point of knowledge if you can't listen to others? This is Bhattacharya, 2nd century BC. If you don't listen to others, you don't learn anything. So that criticality, according to the Indian knowledge system, comes through these forms of stories and different forms of stories. These are just a sample. So let me now do a general conclusion. Then I'll take a pause if there are questions, and then I'll go to the last part of the story that I'm telling you. So there is a focus on drama. that we understand, almost everything that we see in the Indian knowledge systems has a focus on grammar. Now, B.Ed teachers would correct me, or they would tell me differently. So, what are you told? That grammar should be taught explicitly, inductively, deductively? What do you think? Grammar should be taught? Not taught? No, not taught.
Can we talk about functional grammar?
I don't really know what functional grammar is, but I assume the only functional grammar I know was written by Halliday. So, but what do you generally think? How many of you think grammar should be taught in the classroom? No one.
In fact, not directly taught, but then in the course of discussion, when there is an instance and you can take a relevant example
Situation.
and then explain it further, build up on that particular thing. For example, any particular word or a metaphor or a literary text that you are reading, and then you further build on taking them, digressing from that particular topic and explain a concept. If you are creative enough and if you are resourceful, and that is almost at the spur of the moment and not a planned lesson plan or something like that with that particular objective. Again, that is what they force us to do mostly. The institution, that you have to prepare an yearly lesson plan of all the chapters and modules that we are supposed to cover. So sitting during summer vacation, how on earth are we going to suppose or imagine a situation in the class in the month of October or November where I'm supposed to teach this, following up on a crazy schedule and all that. So indirectly, it can be discussed as and when with the progression of the syllabus or the course and so on and so forth. But that's not the case actually how it is being taught in school, higher areas of learning.
Grammar in the Indian knowledge systems is taught explicitly.
But sir, I think it has to be in the context, because we cannot learn syntax or sentence formation in isolation. There has to be some context with it.
Okay.
That's what I.
It's a very popular word that यद्यपि बहुनादेशे तथापि पठपुत्र व्याकरणं.
Yeah.
That is very
So,
explicit.
the first thing I think that one needs to remind to the students that grammar actually we use in our day-to-day language. It is a part, okay, that we use. It is not something that is taught explicitly. It is seen in our language since the day one the baby is born, and the parents they teach that what is your name? My name is XYZ. Okay, so grammar is already there in it. Yeah.
Okay, so how many of you speak English at home?
Occasionally.
Okay, yeah, I was.
Occasionally.
100%.
75%.
Okay. Now the question over here is, what Indian knowledge systems, or what Panini or the grammarian, the Vyakarana tradition says, is that when you are learning a language, which is probably not your home language, you have to teach grammar. Grammar is central. Okay. Now remember, this is, I mean, you can dismiss it as अरे उस ज़माने की बात थी, अभी तो बदल गया है. नहीं बदला है. So N.S. Prabhu, who recently passed away, did a famous project in Bangalore called the Bangalore Project, okay, which was supposed to be on task-based language teaching. And if you have read his book, Second Language Pedagogy, N.S. Prabhu says task-based language teaching, contextual teaching of syntax, words, etc., it's all fine, but in Indian conditions, grammar has to be taught explicitly. There has to be explicit teaching of grammar. And this is not me saying. This is N.S. Prabhu, who is the boss of communicative language teaching in India. Okay. So, completely dismissing the teaching of grammar might have its own repercussions, especially if you are teaching a language that is not your home language. In Gujarati, what I can do with teaching of grammar, if I'm teaching Gujarati, is make you aware of how language functions. But that's also knowledge, no? But if you're teaching English, and that is what the market economy does to you, that as long as you can speak 13 sentences, in English and get a job, it's fine. That's not learning then. That's not knowledge, no? You are learning the language to say yes sir, hello sir, fine sir, thank you sir. Okay? You're not gaining knowledge of that language. In order to gain knowledge, Panini will say, and the grammarians will say, you have to learn grammar. Okay? That contains knowledge. Now they are not saying learn grammar as rote learning.
Okay.
Remember Nyaya? Learn grammar through contextual usage.
That's what by explicit, does he mean that just to provide a set of rules
No,
without
no.
any
In fact, in Gurukulas, when you entered, I'm talking about from 10th century to about 17th, 18th century, till 19th century actually. In Gurukulas, the first thing you were supposed to do was to memorize. Ashtadhyay had to be memorized without understanding a word. The belief was once you get it into your system, then the teacher will say 1.5.2. So we are talking about the Halanta rule now. Okay? And then the teacher will give examples. Understand how this happens? So it is, you know the system, now you explain the system through examples, through context, etc., etc. Okay?
So you mean to say doing followed by knowing? Okay.
So not doing, you are not doing anything. You are simply memorizing texts which you might not understand at all. But once it is there in your memory, and that is something that we are losing very quickly actually, memory.
Just like we grand tables.
That you do it in maths all the time, isn't it? And what do you understand? What does 2 mean and what does 1 mean, what does that cross mean? But you keep on cramming it, no? So when you can do it for other subjects, why not grammar? And Halliday actually will agree with me. Halliday said that functional grammar has to be taught explicitly, right from primary education. He said not even secondary, high secondary, primary education. In Australian education system, grammar is taught explicitly, right from childhood, standard 1. Explicit teaching of grammar.
But sir, what about, let's say, for example, okay, nowadays or even before, the moment the word grammar is uttered in the class, students, they have this feeling of rules and like a mathematics,
Exactly.
which they don't like it.
So use the Deepak and Nyaya, no? So you have to use illustrative examples. You have to make it interesting. So it's not, okay, the subject follows the verb and the verb follows the object. It doesn't make any, what is the subject, what is the object, what is the verb, doesn't matter. Okay? But if you can give you illustrative examples with the rule, then it becomes an interesting, and that is what it propagates, it promotes. So that is the second point. So linguistic interpretation, remember the context and language are both important. It is not something that you simply learn language without the context, or you simply learn only the context and not the language at all. So these are kind of mutually reinforceable. The third point, use of creative textbooks. So I gave you this list of texts that needs to be used for language learning. And these creative textbooks is what you do in lesson plans, right? So this creative text, these poems or short stories or drama or whatever. So these are important for language learning. Narratives are very, very important for language learning. So as I said, it's a combination of both the oral methods. So what used to happen in the classroom is, as I told you in Gurukulas, for example, you will learn Ashtadhyay. Okay, memorize it. Once you memorize it, then you come to the class, and then the explication begins. So what it means, okay, through illustrative examples, through different kinds of practices, etc., etc. But by that time, remember, you already have the grammar in your head. And if you look at modern studies of what is known as language acquisition, we know that children learn like this. So they have a universal grammar that is activated. That's what Chomsky says, right? So you have a universal grammar that is activated. So as you are born, you have a grammar in your head. When you encounter language, it gets activated. Okay, that is what happens. That is what this typical Chomskyan theory says. So let's come to the, if we don't have any more questions, I'll pause for 2 minutes and then move on very quickly because I think we're running out of time. So I'll take a case study. Yes, Vijay.
So then, like, again to that question, teaching grammar explicitly in the class. So what should be our goal as a language teacher in the class? To create linguistic ideals, those who are pro in language, or someone who can use language comfortably in day-to-day life? Because as we teach grammar explicitly, we are focusing on creating those linguistic ideals, those who will speak correctly without errors. But what we need to, I believe that teach students is make them capable to use language in everyday life. So what is your take on this?
So the problem is the binary that has been created. Okay, so it has been assumed that grammar teaching is always ideal teaching. It is not, and that's what I pointed out in the earlier slides. So when Panini is writing his grammar in Ashtadhyayi, he's aware of differences. When Patanjali is commenting on it, he's aware of the differences. People speak in different ways. People contextualize grammar in different ways. There are different ways of production of sentences. Okay? The idea of the ideal comes here. If you want to be a good English speaker, you have to speak like a Britisher. No Britisher speaks with an RP, received pronunciation. But Indians for 200 to 250 years were taught the RP. Does it mean that we do not have an idea of an ideal speaker? Are we simply blaming the British by saying that, oh, they got this idea? No. There is always an idea of the ideal speaker. As I told you, Panini talks about the shishta, the person who speaks well. Okay? But that doesn't mean that you are unaware of people who can speak in different ways. Okay? So nowhere does the system says that you teach grammar explicitly only within ideal limits. Because remember, the Paninian grammar is unlike any other grammar. The Paninian grammar is not the grammar simply of Sanskrit. It is the grammar of a structure of a language. How does language function? Any language. And therefore, Paninian grammar could so easily be used to construct grammars of Gujarati. Early Gujarati grammars were all based on Paninian grammar. Bengali, Marathi. Because the Paninian grammar system is not about Sanskrit. The English grammar system is about English. The Paninian grammar system is about the structure of language itself. How does language function? So the idea over here is not the ideal speaker. This is the ideal speaker of Sanskrit, or this is the ideal speaker of Gujarati. The idea is to make the student aware about the knowledge of the structure of language. That is the idea. But if I am teaching English grammar, then I am simply teaching grammar of English, that's it. I can't use the grammar of English for French, or for German, or for Spanish, or Portuguese, or for any other language. But Paninian grammar, for example, Panini's grammar can be used for many of the Indian languages. I'm not saying all, but many of the Indian languages. Okay? Because again, it explains not really grammatical formation. It explains how the language is structured in a certain way. What happens when a certain structure changes, etc., etc. Okay. Of course, as example, he takes Sanskrit. So examples come from Sanskrit, etc. In fact, there was an experiment of using the Paninian model for computer languages because of the structure of language. So they even tried to use it for modeling computer language, etc. So coming back to your question of whether we should teach explicitly grammar, if it is something that is essential, because grammar, remember, is essential because it contains the code of the language. It is the code, right? It is what we call in modern times the code of a language, the code. Along with the other examples that I gave, with illustrative examples and linguistic variations. If you can combine these three, then I think explicit grammar teaching is not a bad idea at all. Okay? Because if you just come to the class and give students the rules, you're going to become the Panchatantra story, right? You're going to just do rote learning and don't know how to apply it. So the idea of that, bringing that together, is important, I think. Okay, let's go through this very quickly because I think, so I'll tell you the story, a very quick story. The picture that you see over here is a college of Fort William. And this was established in 1800 when the British had come and established, got the province of Bengal as a part of their win against the Nawab of Bengal. So what happened was the British faced a very curious problem because you had these white officers who had come over here in India who didn't have any knowledge of any of the local languages or Arabic or Persian or Sanskrit, which is what the texts were written in, and they wanted to teach. So when these officers were sent to all these places to collect taxes, they would often be cheated. Okay? Because people would say, we don't understand what you're saying, what you're speaking, we don't understand, etc., and they will drive them away. So the then Governor General of Bengal, he came up with the idea that we have to train these teachers into local languages. Okay? They should learn local languages. So this college was established called the College of Fort William. Actually, it was established much before this picture was taken. This painting was made. And College of Fort William was meant, it was a very strange college. Remember, we think of the British as someone who gave us English education. The first college that they established actually is for training their own officers, white officers, remember. These are not Indian officers. They're all white British officers who have come to India, very young kids, 15 to 17 years old, and who need to learn the languages that are there. Okay? And I'm telling you this story for a reason. I'll come to that story, the reason later. So this college existed from 4th May 1800. The dates are also very important because 4th May is also the day when the British defeated Tipu Sultan. And in order to celebrate that we have got this huge territory in Srirangapatnam now, they wanted to establish a college in its honor. So 4th May 1800. And we know exactly when the college closed down. 24th January 1854, when another Governor General said that this is useless, we should stop this. Okay? But it had an existence for 54 years, the College of Fort William. What was done? The idea was that these officers should have local engagement. They should know. So if you look at this, an intimate acquaintance with the history, languages, customs, and manners of the people of India. So this was the idea, this was the goal of the college. What was getting done? These were the languages that were taught. So Arabic, Persian, Persian primarily because remember the Mughals were still there and many of the code documents were in Persian. So Arabic, Persian, and these are the spellings that are used in the document of College of Fort William. Sanskrit, Hindustani.
Mixture of.
So it's, remember, it's not Hindi.
No, it's not.
It's Hindustani is a mixture. Yeah. So you have Hindustani, you have Bengali,
Telugu.
Telugu,
Tamil.
so quite a lot of languages getting taught. Okay. Now for these, it's not a problem. You can have English professors who will come and teach them. But who's going to teach these? don't have teachers. No one knows these languages, except a few who know Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, the classical languages. But the modern languages, how do you teach it? Okay? So they had a curious problem. So what do? They create textbooks. Okay? What kind of textbooks? So if you look at this one,
Polyglot translations.
so this entire textbook is called The Oriental Fabulist. It's written by John Gilchrist, a gentleman who used to teach Hindustani, okay, who had learned Hindustani in 2 years. So he came as an officer from the East India Company, stayed in the central provinces in those days, learned Hindustani in 2 years, became quite an expert in it. And then he comes and says, how do I teach these people, these English officers, Hindustani? So I'll write a book. So he writes a book called Oriental Fabulist, which is basically a translation of Aesop's fables into Hindustani. Okay? It'll be interesting to see the inside of the book, but we don't have time for that. So it's written in English, so a part of it is in English. Then you have Hindi, and then the same thing is written in the Persian script, in Urdu. Yeah? And you have examples of this. So in order to teach Bengali, you have dialogues. So again, it's a very interesting book. So where you have English dialogues, followed by Bengali dialogues, but some of them are not translated. So you have Bengali dialogues which are not translated into English. And you have grammars. So the earliest grammars that get written during this time, the grammar of Marathi, the grammar of Gujarati, the grammar of Bengali, all these grammar books are produced. Yeah? And these are taught to teach language. I hope it reminds you of what we were talking about before this. Exactly the same method that we were talking about. So your use of narratives, you have use of grammar. And so grammar of Sanskrit, etc., etc. And these were the teaching methods. Again, very quickly going through this. And there's a debate of what teaching methods to use. So John Gilchrist, for example, says that there are two methods, theoretical and practical. Men advanced in life ought at once to have recourse to practice. So people who already know the language a bit, Vijay, for example, no grammar, teach them practice. But young people should invariably commence with elementary rules. They should immediately start with grammar. Okay? So there's a debate over there. So this is what Gilchrist says. There's another teacher over there called John Carey, and John Carey says, no, this is wrong. Okay? So what do? Dialogues with translations have been supposed to be useless.
Really?
So he says translation as a method is terrible. It should not be used in the class at all. Remember what method is this? When translation should not be used? The direct method, right? So someone's already started talking about the direct method, that you should use only the language that needs to be taught in the class, no other language has to be there. Yeah. So language has to be taught by application. So it's only through application. You have to struggle with the language and then you learn it. No grammar, remember. So you already have these debates happening. Grammar teaching, not grammar teaching, and that is where we come in as modern ELT practitioners. You know? All these debates start happening at this point of time. Yeah? So what do we learn from this? So one thing is, this method debates is something that comes into existence only after the colonial incursion. Okay? So this entire idea about direct method, and I've given you an example over there, I don't think you can read it. So these were the kind of books that were used in the classrooms at that point of time. Okay? This is a book from 1828. And so they say, you just teach English, nothing else. So in order to learn English, you have to learn only this. So this entire methods debate about whether to use translation, direct method, etc. Remember, before this, before the English colonial education came in, these debates are irrelevant because many languages are taught in the class anyway. Many languages are used in the class anyway. So there's no question of this direct, indirect, whatever, communicative, etc. And these debates become important as time goes on. I'll just end with this, and that is, so remember, these are all English professors. So the British are going to appoint only white men, no women, of course. Now these white men they cannot teach, they do not have enough competence in the language. So what they do is, they appoint what they call munshis. Okay? Munshi is what we call teaching assistants today. So professors, and you have a teaching assistant, mostly PhD scholars, कि तुम ये काम कर दो, वो काम कर दो, etc. Okay? And so these teaching assistants, what they do is they give practice. So professors take the class, that's the elite thing. So they will go and give a lecture. They will come and sit in their room, and then these students will be sent to the munshis, okay, for different languages. So you have munshi for Bengali, you have a munshi for Kannada, munshi for Sanskrit, etc. etc. The Sanskrit, they were not called munshis, they were called pandits. So these people are sent over there, okay, and they practice over there. Now remember, these munshis have all been taught in either a Gurukul system. So we don't have colonial education till then. So they have all come through a traditional, what we call traditional, knowledge system structure, and or through madrasa education. Okay. So these are the kind of people where all these young officers, 15, 17 years old, go and practice their language. This is what happens. Okay. So naturally what starts happening is, the English professors start realizing whatever they're doing in the class, something else is happening when they go and talk to the munshis over there, because the munshis use their own methods of teaching them language. And this leads into huge amounts of problems, leading to sometimes dismissal of munshis, that you are not supposed to do this. Okay? But remember, many of these English officers who learned their own languages also learned it through intermediaries who knew the languages, who again came from a traditional knowledge systems form. Many of them, therefore, what we call English methods, or whatever, the entire method theory, actually carry traces of earlier forms of teaching methods that were already there in India, which is kind of erased now. We don't realize that there are huge amounts of continuities between what we call methods debate and what we call, we all know grammar translation and direct and communicative and this and that, without realizing that many of these terms actually originate from earlier forms of what we call the IKS or Indian knowledge traditions, etc. Yeah? So my final submission is, when we are talking about IKS, this entire myth that has been created, that once the British came, it all disappeared, etc. It was called disrupted. It's not true at all, because language learning models continued as a bridge. British did learn from traditional forms, sources. Their only way of learning an Indian language is by going to the local scholar. There was no way they could learn the language otherwise. In fact, William Jones, for example, keeps on complaining. William Jones is the founder of Asiatic Society, one of the earliest translators. So William Jones keeps on complaining, I don't know whether this Sanskrit guy is telling me the right thing. He keeps on saying this means this, but I'm not very sure. So he's constantly in doubt whether he's been given correct information or they're just fooling around with him, etc., etc. Yeah? And so many of these methods and many of these things that we talk about, language education today, is carried on and has continuities, and we need to look into those continuities very quickly. So what I'm suggesting is that the nature of early language education that we have been talking about through Panini and Bhattacharya and other people had a profound influence on language education, maybe even English language education later, and linkages needs to be explored. Okay, so English language education didn't happen in a vacuum. They came and suddenly replaced everything and changed. So there were linkages constantly, and that needs to be explored, where those linkages happened. Okay, what changed? How did it change? Etc. And remember, there was simultaneous existence of different language learning models during the colonial period. So this entire idea of English came and replaced everything. I can give you an example from Calcutta. The British gave money. We all talk about Hindu college. okay, which was one of the earliest colleges established in India, 1817. And they said Hindu college came and English education took over. Wrong. Hindu college had quite a large number of local languages that were taught. Sanskrit college. British gave money for a Sanskrit college also. So Sanskrit was taught over there. You have the Anglo-Mohammedan college, where the madrasa form of education continued, where teaching of Arabic and Persian continued. Okay. You have the Oriental Seminary, where the mission, the missionary education forms continued. So you have simultaneous language learning models at the same time. So again, this myth that British came and changed everything doesn't seem to apply. At least historically speaking, it doesn't seem to be correct. Okay, and we need to again look into this. And therefore, there are overlaps and continuities that need to be studied. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, we'll quickly take them. But thank you. No. Overshot. Yeah.
When we say that we must not believe that things will change after Methodist, but should we not agree to the fact that after his stopping the grants to the Gurukuls and everything, the whole economical structure was changed. So the way languages and every subject was taught into our system, actually that whole system collapsed after that.
See, it was so that is what the problem is. They feel the thing is that people think that Macaulay came and he wrote the minute and the system changed. It was much more complex than that. So what happened was, we need another session for that. So there is something called a Permanent Settlement Act that comes into existence in 1775. What is Permanent Settlement Act? Permanent Settlement Act gives the British the right to claim taxes from each zamindar in the region, or the king, or whatever, okay? Controlled by the British. Remember, British India is only 37% of India till 1947. Only 37% of India is controlled directly by the British. Other than that, it is principalities. Look at Saurashtra, okay? So there are kings and they pay taxes to the British. So it's not directly controlled by the British. Anyway, so Permanent Settlement Act, what it does is, it tells zamindars, it looks at their land, the production of the land, and they tell them that these many, because you have so much of land, you have to pay me this much tax every year. Now, remember Gurukuls and madrasas, the earlier forms of education, they did not depend on state grant. The idea of granting aid was a different concept then. It was the local zamindars, the local rajas, the local nawabs who used to give money for education. Once you have the Permanent Settlement Act, and when you have to pay quite a substantial tax, what the zamindars, small zamindars especially, and rajas and everyone, they don't have money to sponsor Gurukuls anymore, okay, or madrasas anymore. So these Gurukuls and madrasas start disappearing. But again, there is a different side to the story. Many of these Gurukuls and madrasas also survive because the local villages, they start contributing because the zamindar is not contributing. So if you go back to history, and I can give you documents regarding this. So we have petitions written by local villagers to the British saying, and a very interesting petition, the first line is this: we the people of, this is the first line of our constitution, by the way, we the people of this would like some help from you because we cannot pay the salary of the local schoolmaster. And then Governor General in his meeting minutes writes, there is no money to be given. So then it goes back to them, and then they say, we will all take out 1 anna every month from our own earnings and contribute for the schoolmaster. So it's not that Gurukuls completely disappear, but you're right that the structure of the Gurukuls, or the structure of the earlier forms of schooling, start disappearing. It becomes much more institutionalized. remember, the British give money not only for English education. In fact, they hate Indians to be taught English education. This entire myth, I don't know where it has come from. They give a lot of money for Sanskrit College. You look at Banaras Sanskrit College, the Delhi Sanskrit College, the Calcutta Sanskrit College. They spend a lot of money on teaching of Sanskrit. And English education becomes important only at a later stage of the colonial times, especially after 1857, when there is a fear that there may be further rebellions. So you have to homogenize everything, but that's a very long story. Maybe we'll have discussion some other day.
Sir, I would like to ask you a question. There are two questions. First, one on the Spoda theory and Mimamsa. So you said that Mimamsa theory is more or less what we, as Madam said about Derrida, but don't you think that Spoda theory is also in line with what Derrida said? Like, no word has a definite meaning, the center is not the sector. And my second question is regarding to oracy and literacy, that there is a long debate even in Western culture and here also, that whether oracy preceded literacy or literacy preceded oracy. So what is your take on that? From the presentation it seems, and it is more that in our culture, that it is the oracy which preceded literacy. Okay, because writing came later. First it was oral only, oral narratives or communication. Yeah, so what's your take on this?
So, in the first question that you asked, I'm not in great favor of doing these kind of comparative poetics. Whether, it takes you into traps you don't want to get into. So whether Mimamsa Sphota is like Derrida, I don't know. Is Kalidasa the Shakespeare of India, or is Shakespeare the Kalidasa of England? We don't know, really. These kind of comparative poetics really don't work. Because they are different writers, that's it. Why do I have to compare Kalidasa and Shakespeare? Why do you have to compare Derrida and Mimamsa, Sphota, or whatever? They're from different times, different contexts, different traditions. So it doesn't really make sense. About the second question about oracy and literacy, what I was trying to say is that I'm not denying that there is an oral part to the tradition. There is a very strong oral part. But remember, there is also a very strong written part. Writing is an important part. So if you look at Gupta period, 5th century AD and 4th century AD, okay, where people like Aryabhatta, for example, it was mentioned in the morning, they produced their treatises. They're all written. If you go to Harsha Charita, in one of the chapters, education in the kingdom of Harsha is described. The first thing students learn is writing.
So even in the case of Vedas, because Vyas wanted to compile Vedas, he wanted somebody to write.
Right.
That is why
Yeah.
Ganesh came.
So writing plays a very important role. So this, I don't know how this myth has been circulated, probably by the British. Because see, it's easy to destroy an oral culture.
Yes.
Written cultures are more difficult to destroy. Because you have evidence, no? You have written texts.
But you can burn the libraries.
How many libraries will you burn? It's there in your head. No? So oral cultures, remember, so this entire debate in India about oral culture, written culture, etc., oracy is there. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Orality plays an important role. But it plays an important role in certain cultural forms. Knowledge formation, etc., it's all written. Why is Mahabharata getting written? It could be oral, no? The oral form of the story actually is a very short story. When it gets written, it gets into this massive text. Yeah? So, and all stories, remember, there is either Goddess Saraswati writing, or Ganesha writing, or someone, it's right. Writing is important. It is not something that has to be neglected. And that is where the British got into trouble. That how do you deal with a culture which is so strongly based on writing? They didn't get into trouble in Africa, remember. It was easy. Chinua Achebe talks about it, no? So, but in India, it was difficult.
So, may I ask you one more question, if time permits?
Yeah,
time
sure.
permits? So So from what we just said right now, there is I'm just relating that writing part to the current times of AI and ChatGPT. I'm sorry for that. From IKS, I'm shifting to AI and ChatGPT, but it is an integral part of our life now, of a system now, which we need to accept in any form. Yeah, because we need to keep ourselves updated. So in the in our times of, let's say, when we say about generation Z, yeah, or AI ChatGPT generation, where again it is the same problem is coming, it's emerging. Many times have been referred that firstly is fading, losing attention span, yeah. Then secondly, it is about writing problem, like the students in schools and colleges, they don't like, so like after certain times writing will again disappear. Okay, so sir, what is your again take on it?
Two words, just two words: tapas and medha.
So, referring back to the oral and the written tradition and the myth or the debate between the two, what about the element of apabhrangs or corruption that percolates down, as in when these written texts were copied and then handed over down the generations, and the oral traditions as well? So, is there a method which you can enlighten us with, through which there is a system through which you can authenticate that yes, this is, like you mentioned about the how many types of Ramayana or the different versions of the Mahabharata and so on and so forth. So how today we are, in order to educate ourselves, are able to locate or authenticate that this version of the written text or the oral
I
folklore.
get your question. The only thing is, see, the idea of an authentic original text is not something that is there in our tradition at all. So there is no authentic original text. All texts are intertextual. I told you about Purva Paksha. No? So when you always integrate the knowledge of the previous in order to formulate your own forms of knowledge. It is always intertextual. So the question of authenticity or the original text comes from a tradition which is primarily didactic, so which needs to have an authentic text.
Okay.
Until unless you have an authentic text, you get into trouble. Okay, so just to tell you a story, is one of the reasons that Bhagavad Gita, many other reasons as well, gets translated into English is because the Supreme Court opens in Calcutta in 1772. Now you know when you go to a court as a witness, you have to keep your hand on a book.
Yes.
The problem comes with Hindus. What book will you use? There is no authentic book. No? So they need a book. So Gita becomes the book. You understand? It could be any book. It could be Vedas, it could be Upanishads, it could be Brahmanas, it could be Aranyakas, it could be anything. But you need an authentic text. Okay? Like a Bible or a Quran or whatever.
So with this element of intertextuality, sometimes there are differences with regards to the viewpoints that are expressed in these versions of the text, which leads to further factions at times.
We are argumentative. It's an argumentative tradition. I told you, it is not a tradition that easily accepts things. I told you 2,000-year-old debates. Which cultures have 2,000-year-old debates? 2,000, I'm not even exaggerating, it's 2,000-year-old debates. Which cultures have that? You tell me. We are argumentative. We argue. Okay? I'm talking about apabhranshas. Literature is filled with it. If you look at early literature, look at Bhasa, for example. So the servants speak in Prakrit and Apabhransa. The kings and the queens, they speak in Sanskrit. So you have this idea of a dual language system already there. I mean, it's acceptable. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.